contact with the Beach Boys at all these days?
Not at all. No, I don't like Mike Love at all because I don't like his attitude is too egotistical.
On June 11, 2025, Brian Wilson died at his home in Beverly Hills at the age of 82. The world remembered him as a boy from Hawthorne who heard entire orchestras in his head before he could read music. The man behind God Only Knows and Good Vibrations, the reclusive genius who spent decades fighting his own mind just to keep making beautiful things. But almost every obituary, every tribute, every retrospective that week mentioned one other name in the same breath: Mike Love. For 64 years, Brian Wilson and his cousin were bound together by blood, by harmony, and by a resentment that never fully healed. This is a story of how two boys who once sang into the same microphone in a garage in Hawthorne became two old men who could barely stand to be in the same room, and why, even at the very end of his life, Brian Wilson still hadn't made peace with it. Brian Wilson and Mike Love were family before they were bandmates. Brian's mother, Audrey, and Mike's mother, Emily, were sisters, which made the two boys first cousins who grew up practically in each other's backyards in Hawthorne, California. Brian was a quiet one, the boy who could pick out harmonies on the piano before he was old enough for school, obsessive about the sound of his own voice blending with others. Mike was louder, funnier, more comfortable in front of a crowd, the kind of kid who could work a room without trying. On paper, they were an unlikely pair. In practice, they became the two halves of sound that would define an era of American music. It started, as these things often do, almost by accident. Brian's younger brothers Dennis and Carl were around, along with a family friend named Al Jardine, and in 1961 the five of them put together a song about a fad that was sweeping Southern California beaches. Dennis, the only one who actually surfed, pushed for the idea. Brian wrote the melody. Mike wrote most of the words and sang lead. The song was called Surfin', and when it started getting played on local radio, something shifted. What had been a family hobby suddenly looked like it could be a career. Within a year, they'd signed with Capitol Records, and the hits started coming fast. Surfin' Safari, Surf USA, fun, fun, fun. Brian handled the music. Mike handled a lot of the lyrics and the stage presence, and together they built an image of California as an endless summer, all sunshine and surfboards and hot rods. It worked because it felt effortless, even though behind the scenes Brian was already pushing himself far harder than anyone realized, chasing sounds that were more complicated than anything the surf pop formula really needed. For a few years, though, the partnership functioned. Brian brought the ambition. Mike brought the audience. Neither one could have guessed how far apart those two instincts would eventually pull them. By late 1964, the Beach Boys were one of the biggest acts in the country, touring constantly, recording constantly, living inside a machine that never really stopped. Brian was the one absorbing most of the pressure. He was writing the songs, producing the records, arranging the vocals, and trying to keep a genuine artistic vision alive while also functioning as the band's de facto business engine. It caught up with him on a flight to Houston in December that year, when Brian had what by most accounts was a full breakdown midair, crying, shaking, unable to continue. He never really went back to full-time touring after that. What happened next mattered more than people realized at the time. With Brian off the road, session musician Glenn Campbell briefly filled in, and Bruce Johnston was eventually brought in as a permanent touring replacement. Brian, meanwhile, stayed home and threw himself into the studio almost entirely on his own terms. He started working with a rotating cast of elite Los Angeles session players, the group of musicians who would later become known as the Wrecking Crew, building backing tracks piece by piece, layering sounds in ways the band had never attempted before. It gave him total control over the architecture of the music. It also meant that, for the first time, Brian was creating almost entirely separately from the rest of the group, including Mike. The music changed accordingly. Albums like The Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights pushed towards something more emotionally exposed, slower, sadder, more introspective than the surfing cars formula that had made them famous. Mike noticed a shift immediately, and he didn't like it. He believed, not without reason, that the band's success had been built on a specific promise to its audience. Fun, simple, sun-soaked music that made people feel good. He worried that Brian's new direction was too strange, too personal, too far removed from what had made him a hit machine in the first place. Those worries didn't stay quiet for long. If there's a single moment where the partnership between Brian and Mike visibly cracked, it's the making of Pet Sounds in 1966. Brian had bigger ambitions than another Beach Boys record. He wanted to make something that would be taken seriously as art, something that stood alongside the most respected music being made anywhere, and he built it almost entirely without Mike, who was out on the road with the rest of the touring band while Brian worked in the studio with lyricist Tony Asher. The songs that came out of those sessions were unlike anything the group had done: meditations on love, loneliness, growing up in doubt, dressed in some of the most intricate arrangements ever put on a pop record. Mike heard most of it only after it was largely finished, and his reaction was blunt. He reportedly dismissed the album as Brian's ego music, a phrase that stuck around for decades afterward as shorthand for exactly how wide the gap between the two men had become. One song became a flashpoint in particular. An early version carried lyrics influenced by Brian's growing use of drugs, and Mike pushed hard against it, eventually forcing a rewrite that changed both the words and the title. It might sound like a small skirmish over one song, but it was really a preview of a war that would go on for the rest of their lives. Brian wanted to chase his own instincts wherever they led, and Mike insisting that someone needed to protect the audience and the band's livelihood from those instincts. History has been kinder to Pet Sounds than the American public was in 1966. Critics loved it. Musicians loved it. Paul McCartney would later call it one of his favorite albums ever made, and its influence on Sgt. Pepper's is well documented. But commercially, in the U.S., it underperformed compared to the group's earlier records. To Mike, that felt like vindication. To Brian, it felt like the world rejecting the most honest thing he'd ever made. That gap between critical love and commercial disappointment would define the rest of their disagreement. Brian believed in the future of the sound. Mike believed in the audience that was already there, and neither one was entirely wrong. If Pet Sounds cracked the relationship, the Smile Sessions broke it. Fresh off the massive success of Good Vibrations, a single that took months and tens of thousands of dollars to build, piece by piece, in multiple studios, Brian set out to make what he intended as a genuine masterpiece, an album that would push popular music somewhere it had never been. He brought in Van Dyke Parks to write lyrics, and together they built songs out of fragments, abstract, poetic, sometimes deliberately strange, built more like modernist collage than pop songwriting. Mike didn't understand it, and he said so. There's a well-documented account of Mike confronting Van Dyke Parks directly during the recording of Cabin Essence, demanding to know what a particular lyric actually meant, frustrated that the words didn't tell a clear story the way the band's earlier songs always had. Parks reportedly didn't answer him. The moment captured something bigger than one confusing lyric. It captured two men who no longer shared a common language for what the music was supposed to do. Mike wasn't just uneasy about specific words. He felt shut out of a creative process he'd once been central to, and he worried loudly that Brian was steering the band some of the audience would never follow. The pressure broke Brian before it broke the album. He kept restructuring songs, re-recording sections, losing confidence in pieces he'd already finished, second-guessing himself under criticism from bandmates, the label, and his own escalating paranoia. His mental health, already fragile, deteriorated further. By the middle of 1967, he abandoned Smile entirely. What emerged instead was a stripped-down, hastily assembled record called Smiley Smile, built partly from the wreckage of what Brian had originally intended. After that collapse, Brian started pulling away from the band almost entirely. Fewer sessions, fewer decisions, less presence. And as Brian faded into background, Mike stepped forward to fill the space he left behind. By the start of the 1970s, the group that had once dominated American pop was struggling for relevance. Brian's involvement had become sporadic and unpredictable, shaped by declining mental health and increasing drug use. Meanwhile, Mike, along with Carl and Dennis, tried to hold the band together through a run of albums that never quite recaptured the old magic. Then, in 1974, something unexpected happened. Capitol released a compilation called Endless Summer, pulling together the group's early hits, and became a massive, unlikely success, climbing the charts and reintroducing the Beach Boys to a new generation. Mike saw exactly what that meant. The band's future, commercially at least, was in its past. He pushed hard for nostalgia-driven touring built around the old Surfing Cars catalog, and it worked. Audiences turned out in huge numbers for it. Around the same time, the band's management tried to build a comeback narrative around Brian himself, a campaign that promised a return to the genius behind the music. The problem was that Brian wasn't ready. He was pushed into the spotlight before he'd stabilized, and he later described feeling used by the whole effort, treated, in his own words, more like a mascot than a musician who was actually being listened to. The resentment that had been building for a decade finally became a legal matter in 1977, when Mike filed a lawsuit claiming he'd never received proper songwriting credit or payment for lyrical contributions to some of the band's biggest hits from the 60s. The case dragged on for years. Mike eventually won a substantial settlement. For Brian, being taken to court by his own cousin, over the very songs that had once represented the best years of their partnership, added a new and deeply personal layer of betrayal to a relationship that was already buckling under everything else. The years right after Smile collapse are often treated as a footnote, but they set the pattern for everything that came after. With Brian mostly retreating from leadership, his younger brothers Dennis and Carl started filling the creative vacuum in ways nobody would have predicted a few years earlier. Dennis, who'd spent most of the band's history as a drummer with almost no songwriting input, began writing music that was raw and emotionally direct, some of it drawing on a personal life that was, by most accounts, considerably wilder than the band's clean-cut image suggested. Carl, always the most even-tempered of the Wilson brothers and blessed with arguably the best voice in the group, quietly became the band's most reliable creative and emotional anchor, someone both Brian and Mike still trusted even as they trusted each other less and less. This created an entirely new kind of instability. Instead of one clear creative direction, Brian's ambition versus Mike's commercial instincts, the band now had several competing visions pulling at once. Mike wanted to protect the classic sound that had built their career. Carl and Dennis wanted to keep pushing into more personal, adult territory. Brian, when he showed up at all, contributed in fragments, sometimes brilliant, often incomplete, rarely sustained. It meant that even when the public feud between Brian and Mike was making headlines, the band itself was quietly fracturing into factions, none of them fully aligned, all of them nominally still called the Beach Boys. By the time the band's commercial fortunes started to slide in the early 70s, that internal fragmentation had become the group's defining condition. Albums like Sunflower and Surf's Up earned some of the best reviews of the band's career, proof that there was still real creative gas left in the tank collectively, but commercially they went nowhere in the U.S., reinforcing Mike's argument that critical acclaim didn't pay for tour buses or studio time. It's worth sitting with that tension, because it never actually resolved. Every time the band tried something more ambitious, it either fizzled commercially or got overshadowed by yet another wave of old hits nostalgia that sold better than anything new they were making. Mike had evidence on his side. Brian had the reviews. Neither side ever fully won the argument, which is part of why it never stopped. The 1980s brought a different kind of conflict, one centered less on music and more on control over Brian's very fragile life. In 1983, Brian's family brought back psychologist Dr. Eugene Landy to help manage his serious physical and mental decline. What followed was an arrangement that went far beyond conventional therapy. Landy moved into Brian's home, controlled his diet, his schedule, his social contacts, and eventually his finances and music career as well, positioning himself as manager and co-writer in addition to therapist. Brian did show visible physical improvement under this regime, but the level of control alarmed the people around him, Mike included. Mike, along with other band members, grew increasingly distrustful of how much power one man had been given over Brian's entire life. That distrust didn't stop Brian from defending Landy publicly for years, even as it strained his relationship with the rest of the band further. Brian began working on solo material under Landy's direction, material that existed almost entirely outside the Beach Boys framework the others had spent decades protecting. That tension showed up on record in 1985, when the Beach Boys released a self-titled album, their first without Dennis, who had drowned in 1983. Every remaining member contributed, Brian included, and the album leaned into a slicker, more contemporary 80s production sound. It proved the band could still technically function as a unit, but by most accounts the sessions were strained, shaped as much by outside pressure and competing agendas as by any shared creative vision. It was collaboration in name more than in spirit. A group of men who could still make a record together without necessarily wanting to. 3 years later, in 1988, that tension became public in a far more uncomfortable way. At the ceremony inducting the Beach Boys into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an occasion that should have been a straightforward celebration of everything the band had built, Mike used his acceptance speech to take pointed jabs at contemporaries like Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney, daring them to still be touring and performing the way the Beach Boys were. He also made comments that hinted, not very subtly, at unresolved friction within his own band. It was a kind of moment that made industry insiders wince, a night meant to honor a legacy instead becoming one more small, public crack in it. Then, in 1991, Brian released an autobiography, Wouldn't It Be Nice? My Own Story. The book described Mike in deeply unflattering terms: controlling, resistant to real artistic growth, dismissive of the very ambitions that had produced Brian's most celebrated work. It later came out that much of the book had actually been shaped by people around Brian at the time rather than written by him in any straightforward sense, which made its contents even more complicated. Were these Brian's true feelings, filtered through someone else's pen, or someone else's narrative wearing Brian's name? Mike, for his part, treated it as real and damaging, and by the mid-1990s he filed a defamation suit over it. The case was settled out of court, but added yet another layer of legal and personal wreckage to a relationship that had already survived one lawsuit and years of creative warfare. In 1998, Carl Wilson died of lung cancer. Carl had spent decades as the group's quiet stabilizer, the one member both Brian and Mike still trusted, the one who could keep the peace when everyone else had stopped speaking the same language. His death removed whatever balance was left. Al Jardine drifted toward the margins of the band's touring operation. Brian grew even more private, and Mike, who had gained increasing legal control over the Beach Boys' name and brand, spent the next decade leading versions of the group built almost entirely around the classic hits, often without any of the other original members present, which is what made 2011 such a genuine surprise. After everything, the lawsuits, the decades of creative disagreement, the years of barely speaking, Brian, Mike, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, and David Marks announced they were reuniting for the band's 50th anniversary. It wasn't just a nostalgia tour. In 2012, they released That's Why God Made the Radio, their first album with Brian fully involved in decades, and it debuted at number 3 on the Billboard chart. For a few months, it genuinely looked like something had healed. The tour that followed ran more than 70 dates across the world, and by most accounts Brian seemed happy on stage, present in a way he hadn't been in years. Then, before the year was out, Mike announced he'd continue touring under the Beach Boys name without Brian, Al, or Dave.